very little margin for
Mhm.
error. Like if we fuck this up, it'll have a ripple effect, and then it'll throw our schedule off, and we don't have money to do that. So it's just
Nutties, nutties, let me have Pikachu. Nutties, nutties.
We met at the beach.
You gotta get a cheese pizza, extra cheese, beef patty and cheese, extra cheese with the pepperoni.
Who is she?
I'm about to be a father!
I'm checking K with Mike Chat. Joel Alfonso Vargas, how are you today?
what's up? What's up? How are you?
I am well. Listen, I watch Mad Bills to Pay or Destiny, Dilo que no soy malo. This, yeah, this movie, I love this movie so much just because everybody uses the word authentic all the time, but this is such a true, authentic visual storytelling for New York City, for the Bronx specifically. And I wanted to know, like, it's the backdrop. The Bronx is the star of the movie. What did it mean to bring your hometown to the screen in this way? And was there pressure that came with that?
Yeah, it's obviously the pressure to kind of get it right was high, but I didn't really have to think about it so much because I'm from that community. So,
Hmm.
as long as I stayed true to, my lived experience and, the sort of experiences of the people I grew up around, things I've observed, I knew I would be okay. So like I didn't really overthink it, honestly. It was just like I just wanted to put a lens to it, and it was as
Hmm.
simple as that, it wasn't like I didn't have to do any mental gymnastics to get there.
Right. And trust me, it came off that way when watching it because it just felt like it's just felt so natural and it flowed. I want to talk more about Rico now, and he's described as
Mhm.
an amalgamation of the guys you grew up around. How
Yes.
much of yourself is in him or people in your family that you drew that character from?
Yeah, I mean it's very interesting because
Mhm.
I was kind of writing this story, developing the story like against the backdrop of a breakup. So I was like with a partner for like, almost like 10 years, and we were breaking
Mhm.
up and things like this. And we had met when I was in my early 20s, and I was
Mhm.
making the film in my 30s basically. And in that span of time for a young man, like there's a lot of growth that happens and
Right.
things. So despite my writing this film about or this film being about like teenagers basically,
Mhm.
like which is very removed from like a 30-year-old man. I kind of these patterns of self-sabotage and things like this, like that was somehow like I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of writing a little bit about that relationship as well and things,
Mhm.
like not to that extreme, but I saw myself in that situation, in other words, only after the fact. And I'm like, oh shit, yeah, like that makes sense. But, outside of that, yeah, I did grow up in a community where, a lot of young men had struggles, coming from single parent households and things, growing up
Mhm.
without a dad. I grew up without a dad, and sort of like the impacts of that on your, I guess, concept of what it means to be a man, which, you're kind of left to your own devices to figure out. I like to say that my mom was like my mom and my dad. She was like my
Yeah.
mother, my father. But,
Mhm.
she, at the end of the day, father is a father, like there are things that you learn from a father, and,
Mhm.
many of us didn't get. But beyond that, my mom was a teen mom. So it's in a way like trying to tell her story. I have a paternal brother who was a teen dad,
Mhm.
who is very much like Rico. It's kind of like trying to tell his story. I grew up around a lot of guys as well who were just sort of like they were just almost like human tornadoes, like it was
Right.
just so it's like all these things kind of coming together, converging, and that's kind of what led to Mad Dose.
Yeah, I love that. And I want to circle back to something you mentioned at the beginning of your answer. You
Yeah.
said you basically this is based on your previous relationship. How much of that actual relationship did you show us through Rico and Destiny?
It's not so it's not a direct adaptation, it's
Oh,
not
okay.
that first,
All
but
right.
they're just like some, like I think just that kind of
Mm-hmm.
like immaturity, like
Yeah.
differences in maturity level. Like you can have
Mm-hmm.
people that are around the same age, but I do
Mm-hmm.
think that like especially when you're that age,
Yeah.
like women, just young women kind of just like
Mm-hmm.
mature a lot faster than young men. It takes us at least this is my opinion, it takes us a longer time. So I could see these sort of like patterns or that disparity in maturity, and like just this kind of like again like this self-sabotaging behavior, which I think is not obviously inherent just to young men. Young women do that too, but that's the similarity that
Mm-hmm.
I think I was like in my heart when I was writing the, I guess, the screenplay, you could say.
Yeah. And a topic I actually want to pick at right now
Yeah.
because you just mentioned about growth and maturity, and I think that's one of the biggest themes in this film is,
Mm.
the cost of being forced to grow up before you're ready. So do you think the system is designed that way for young men of color, or is it more neglect than design?
I think it's a combination of both things. I don't think they're exclusive to one another.
Yeah.
I think that especially like a place like the Bronx, there are a lot of, I feel like there's so many beautiful things about the Bronx. And like, I never try to frame it in the sense of like
Hmm.
an area that's lacking, but in terms of, like education and just kind of like, public resources and so on, like it's not a place in the city that gets a lot of resources for that. So of course, like, you have people kind of literally living on the margin or, like living in poverty, basically all the while like there's like cost of living crisis, like affordability crisis, like people are struggling to make ends meet, that compounded by like many households that are single parent households and things like all these things kind of if you're a young man coming up,
Yeah.
you feel the pressure, you feel the pressure, you got to man up, you got to like hold it
Mhm.
down for your household. And I think what's like really tragic about that is that like in other sort of maybe like social classes, like when you have this real usually a phase in your life where you can actually be like a young person, and like
Mhm.
in your 20s you can kind of like it's like a discovery phase, and you can like try
Mhm.
things and really find your identity and stuff like that. Like I feel like for a lot of young people, both men and women, in a place like coming up in a place like the Bronx,
Right.
they don't have that chance. So like they're
Mhm.
16, 17, 18, they go from literally being a child to then like being an adult,
Mhm.
and that inherently is like that you can't just make that leap right away. Like that's a
Mhm.
journey, right? And that's like where I see the core of a lot of like the sort of tension and sometimes these self-sabotaging behaviors stem from,
Mhm.
if I'm making sense. I don't know, but like yeah.
No, no, you're definitely making sense. And
Yeah.
it's something that makes me want to ask. I was going to ask this towards the end, but I want to know this now. Is basically, and spoiler alert, in that
Okay.
very last scene when we
Mm.
see Destiny and Rico, they're at the gender reveal party out in the park. And it
Mm.
just ends with them just sitting there like, oh, this is real now. This is my life. So what did that moment mean? Because I walked out of the theater like, oh, okay, what's happening now? So yeah, explain that to me.
Yeah, I think it was meant to end on like maybe like ambiguous note.
Hmm.
I didn't want to. I think as you could tell, like throughout the whole movie, like I'm not there to judge. I'm not there
Right.
to give answers as
Hmm.
the filmmaker and filmmakers, behind the camera. Like we're
Hmm.
just there to kind of like show a family's reality,
Hmm.
and to the degree that you can say reality because it's fiction. But so it was meant to be open ended. Like I wanted audiences to really for it to be a point of discussion, so the audience is really just sort of like
Hmm.
really talk about like what happened to these two kids, and I kind of intentionally left it that way because I've seen that story play out both ways. I've seen
Yeah.
people get their act together and really step up to the the challenge of
Hmm.
teen parenthood, and I've seen other
Hmm.
people completely drop the ball. So
And Joel, before I let you go, I have to ask you about the
yeah.
craft and the process of this
Mm.
entire thing because you shot 100 scenes in 16 days,
Yeah.
mostly with improv. So how did you hold the vision together when so much is deliberately left open?
It was a fight every day.
Hmm.
It was because I was working with improvisation. That in itself is like an exploratory process, and like you don't usually get there on the first take, when you're
Hmm.
kind of improvising, trying to find the moment. But on the other hand, we were limited on resources and time and things like that. So it just became everything became like a negotiation in the sense of getting what I need and placing a lot of rigor on that, and then
Hmm.
balancing that with the realities of like, okay, like this is, we got to make the day. Like if we like, there's like very little margin for
Hmm.
error. Like if we fuck this up, it'll have a ripple effect, and then it'll throw our schedule off, and we don't have money to do that. So it's just like that whole dance, the real challenge for me.
Yeah, that's amazing. Joel, thank you so much. Congratulations again on Mad Bills to Pay. I can't wait for everyone to see this. All of New York needs to see this.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you, thank you. I
Yes,
appreciate you. Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah.